Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Right to Know, your weekly Pennsylvania policy podcast from the PLS Reporter. I'm Justin Schweitzer, joined by my friend, as always, Sam Zern. Sam, how are you this week?
I am doing all right. Bit of a hectic week over here. Big things in the works here that you all will learn about shortly. Little teaser there. But yeah, no, it's been a pretty good week. Pretty exciting week of getting the ball rolling here in Harrisburg.
Is that a new plant I see?
It is. I forgot its name, but it's very fun and speckled. So
Fun and speckled. There we go. No botany lessons here. That's about the extent of what you'll get
definitely not.
on that plant, anyway. Maybe next week we'll have a different one to discuss, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. But this week, I think, from my interpretation of the news in Harrisburg, there seemed to be two major, kind of noteworthy developments. There was no session this week. So, the news coming out of Harrisburg was relegated to, a committee hearing, a final committee hearing on election oversight. And, kind of a new unexpected update on the vaccine administration front. And, we'll start with vaccines because that also has national implications. So, we kind of talked about Pennsylvania's vaccine rollout over the past few months. It started off kind of slow and faced some, speed bumps and hiccups along the way. And like starting in, March and April, things really seemed to pick up. This month, vaccine eligibility was opened up to everybody starting earlier this week. So things really kind of seem to be chugging along. We're close to having, I think, 7 million people or 7 million vaccines administered in Pennsylvania. Last time I checked, we had around 2.4 million fully vaccinated. I'm sure that's risen a bit since I last looked. I did not look today, admittedly. I was in full newsletter mode for most of the day. So those of you who do not subscribe to our new Reporter Rewind, that's a cheap plug for you to subscribe to that, because we will have more vaccine information then, with that when it comes out tomorrow. But anywho, so this week, things are really continuing along. Vaccine eligibility opened up to all Pennsylvanians this week. That was, due to the state's accelerated vaccine rollout. But then something happened this week, Sam, didn't it? There was a joint statement released by the FDA and the CDC, two federal agencies, recommending a pause to the use of the Johnson & Johnson COVID-19 vaccine. And that's the one-shot vaccine that, in Pennsylvania anyway, was used as part of a special initiative to vaccinate teachers, school staff, child care workers. That initiative is finished, but this federal pause, was put into place as a result of six cases of rare but pretty severe blood clots experienced solely by women, so 6 women, after they had received the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. There's no clear indication right now that those blood clots were directly linked to the vaccine, but because they happened in multiple people within a specific period of time after they got the vaccine, FDA and the CDC are kind of erring on the side of caution as they review the significance of those blood clot cases. And so as a result of that, Pennsylvania suspended the use of the J&J vaccine this week until April 24th. And that's at the earliest. They're still waiting on further guidance, as the CDC gets together to continue reviewing these cases. But, right now that means out of the 3 vaccines that we did have as part of the state's vaccination plan, there are only 2 right now, and those are the Pfizer. That's a different federal thing going on. The Pfizer vaccine, and the Moderna vaccine. And so with that pause comes concerns about, whether those blood clot cases will result in, vaccine hesitancy. There are some saying that the pause shouldn't have happened at all, that'll dissuade people from trying to get the vaccine. but the Wolf administration officials, acting Health Secretary Alison Beam and Governor Tom Wolf, they both say that this just points to an effective vaccine evaluation process, that, it's just a review that's necessary to make sure the vaccines are safe, because nationwide, there's been a little under 7 million Johnson & Johnson shots administered. And out of 7 million people, that's, just 6 cases of these blood clots. So it's something that right now doesn't appear to be too common. Oh my God, I can't talk. Right now, it doesn't appear to be, too common, but, it's federal government, erring on the side of caution, as, Wolf and others will state.
Well, the Johnson & Johnson is an interesting one here in Pennsylvania because, I can't speak to other states, but I imagine some are doing, their own version of this. J&J, being that it's a one-shot vaccine, has been allocated to certain professional populations. So Pennsylvania's teacher vaccination initiative, where teachers kind of had their own separate, it wasn't a phase, but it was outside of the phases designation, but access to vaccines earlier than their original phase, that was using the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And now J&J has been allocated to a group of other professions. So grocery store workers, law enforcement, fire, and agriculture and meatpacking, I believe, are the groups that are getting it. I also think correctional officers and prisons are in there, people who are, incarcerated in prisons are included there. So those groups were identified for the J&J vaccine. And now with this pause, that's not saying that they don't have access to the other vaccines. Everybody has access to vaccine sign up, but that special phase initiative is on pause. I think Secretary Beam was talking about that today. People who were scheduled for the J&J vaccine can still get vaccines. They're just going to get Pfizer or Moderna. But did anything come up in this most recent press conference kind of about the pause?
Really, I think right now it's just, the administration is taking sort of a wait and see approach. There is I don't remember the name of the group, but there is some sort of special vaccine related entity that's, going to be continuing to review this and making a decision. And, their next meeting date is around a week out or so. So this pause is, I guess, going to continue to sort of a short-term, wait and see kind of thing, unless, a long-term pause would be, recommended by CDC and the FDA. But yeah, you were spot on. The special initiative to vaccinate, correction officers and other frontline workers, that was put on pause. Secretary Beam mentioned that today. So, it's undoubtedly probably going to have an impact on the rate of, vaccines that get put into arms, as people like to say. But, I think the good news is that, the state really has kind of ramped up its vaccine infrastructure, and providers seem to, be moving a lot more efficiently as, the state gets a significant, significant number of more vaccines than, we were getting in January and February. And the hesitancy thing is kind of interesting to me because, Wolf and Beam were asked about that today. And I think someone who made a really interesting case, it wasn't either of those two, but there was a physician from Penn State Hershey, Dr. William Curry, who works at Penn State Hershey's Department of Family and Community Medicine. He, just like Wolf and Beam, stressed that, the clots occurred in a small fraction of, the total number of people who have received the J&J shot nationwide. And I pulled a quote here that I think, is pretty important to remember as, people, I'm sure there's some out there who may be weighing whether or not to get vaccinated right now after hearing the Johnson & Johnson news. But Curry said today, he said, one thing that we need to remember is that while there are a lot of people who have survived COVID, there's a large number of people who continue to live with life-altering issues. many people who have survived COVID continue to live with heart issues, neurologic issues, breathing issues. Many people become what we call long haulers, people who continue to suffer with COVID implications for weeks and months. A person not getting vaccinated puts not only themselves at risk, but their loved ones to the possibility of, suffering any long-term implications of COVID-19. And I think, that's something, especially now, that people can forget, is that COVID, can leave a lot of, lingering long-term health issues. I knew someone myself, it was my old hairdresser, she had COVID and she felt fatigued for weeks after she had it and even after she recovered. And, that's probably more of, a minor issue compared to what some others have experienced, because, blood clotting and, other sort of circulatory issues are kind of common complications of COVID in, more severe cases. And that's something that, Curry was really stressing, is that, there are a lot more negative implications with getting COVID-19 than with getting a vaccine for COVID. So, he was urging, amidst these conversations of potential vaccine hesitancy, that, people really still do need to get a Pfizer shot or a Moderna shot. And he added too that the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are, they're really a different type of vaccine than the Johnson & Johnson. So that if people are worried that, some similar effects may occur with those, that, there's a total different scientific makeup there. And I'm not a science writer, I'm not a scientist, so I'm not going to really comment on what those differences are. But, this was a Penn State Hershey physician, local physician, really trying to stress the need to continue to get vaccinated, even amid these Johnson and Johnson issues. So in terms of long-term timeline, I don't have any answers, and I don't think anyone really does at this point. It's going to come down to, the decisions of the CDC and FDA. But I mean, the good news here is, at least to date, there don't seem to be a lot of, reported severe blood clot cases, and, vaccines really do seem to be readily available. Wolf and Beam said today, we're at a point where, providers are trying really hard to just get appointments filled because the state has a pretty decent supply right now. And that's, a huge shift from a few months ago when, people were clamoring to just try and make an appointment. So, I think the Johnson & Johnson issue is a hiccup here, and I'm not trying to downplay any of the potential medical implications, but, it seems like all in all, the state's vaccine program is moving in the right direction, which I think, people on both sides of the aisle, every side and corner of the political spectrum, are, pleased with, as the state tries to get back to some semblance of normalcy.
And hey, Wolf is getting vaccinated on Monday. Right?
He is. He said his first shot is on Monday. He said he didn't know what shot he's getting. He just said he's getting a shot in New York. But there's a 50-50 chance of guessing what he gets. So if any listeners guess, you don't get anything, but bragging rights, I guess. I don't know.
Have fun with it. I am a Moderna personally. You got the other one though, right? You got Pfizer.
Yeah, I got Pfizer last weekend. Have another shot in a few weeks. So
I had very few symptoms or very few side effects. I was just pretty tired, but that could also be my horrific caffeine in the afternoon habits. So, there you go for your vaccine hesitancy.
well,
It's a great shot. It felt great. I mean, that was
felt great.
It sounds weird to say it felt great, but I am very good about getting my flu shot, and that shot hurts more than the Moderna did. I did not feel the Moderna go in at all. I definitely felt it the next day. It was sore, but it was quick and easy.
I'll give a cheap plug for Pfizer, I guess, but I did not have any side effects whatsoever with my first shot. Maybe a touch of soreness the next day, but I think to your point, most of the flu shots I've gotten throughout my life hurt a lot more in terms of post-shot soreness than the Pfizer shot did. So, but hopefully the second one, which is where I hear, some of the side effects can be a little stronger. Hopefully I'll fare the same with that. But no, I was pretty lucky. No symptoms myself.
It's working.
Right. Right. Well, at first, and I joked, I was like, oh my God, like my arm's not sore. Like, did I get a faulty shot or something? Like, did I not get it? But there's some soreness the next day. And, I was like, okay, it's sore. I got it. It wasn't like an empty syringe or something, but I shouldn't joke about that with the hesitancy questions, but too late now. It's on the recording. But I think this offers, unless you have any other vaccine related notes.
I do not. Yeah, no notes.
Offers a good place to transition into what you so aptly described as the finale of election oversight hearings in the House. There are still some going on in the Senate. There's one scheduled next week. But the House State Government Committee, did conclude their what was originally scheduled to be 14 election oversight hearings, but that schedule was retooled a bit to dial it down to 10 hearings. So 10 election oversight hearings. And Sam, you kind of took a look at what these hearings as a whole will mean for potential election reforms in Harrisburg. So I will hand the baton off to you here and kind of let you run us through.
Yeah, so like you said, we have since January been having somewhat regular Thursday afternoon election hearings in the House State Government Committee. Now, when these were first introduced, they were, they're brought by the chair, Representative Seth Grove. They were pitched as not looking back at 2020, but deciding how we chart the path forward. Whether that held true or not during the process there was a lot of references to 2020 in the idea that we were looking forward throughout the process. I will say that. They were lengthy with lots of testifiers, lots of minutia into how elections are administered. So over the course of these 10 hearings, we heard from groups like the County Commissioners Association, we heard from on the ground election officials. I think there were some informational videos about scanning ballots. So really a deep dive for lawmakers into how elections work, and actually looking into what the code that they write looks like on the ground. Which, that kind of was the undercurrent of all the meetings, but there were also quite a bit of recommendations from quite a vast array of groups. So there were, a handful of nonpartisan groups like the County Commissioners Association who came in throughout these hearings. I will admit I was not a very frequent attendee at all of them. I definitely spot checked the meetings throughout. But the various times that I tuned in, the County Commissioners Association, when they were there, were kind of beating the same drum that they have been for my entire time here in Pennsylvania. And I'm assuming beforehand, which is essentially that they want more days to pre-canvass ballots. So they want to be able to prepare ballots for counting ahead of Election Day, particularly because we have mail-in balloting in Pennsylvania, and that's a pretty popular option at this point. They need a little bit more time to open everything so we don't have delays like we did in 2020 when they didn't have pre-canvassing time. So that's one of the big ones. There's also, they want to change some deadlines around so that the mail-in ballot application deadline is pushed back. Currently, it's too close to Election Day for the post office to actually get ballots back in time. And so the County Commissioners Association is voters are following the law as it's written. They're not doing anything wrong by, even if it is waiting till the last minute. That's how a deadline works. You're allowed to go up to the deadline, but then their vote can't get back in time. And so in 2020, we saw there was a state Supreme Court allowed ballots to come in 3 days after the election because there were so many delays in the post office. that was not a well-received decision by members of the General Assembly, particularly Republican members of the General Assembly. But people who, were in support of that decision are, kind of around the idea of like, well, what else were they supposed to do? Just disenfranchise all those votes because of a post office delay? So there's still tensions from 2020 running very, very high. I mean, I don't think we expected them to abate really. But I think one of the takeaways worth going into here. So we've had these 10 election hearings. For folks who are, watching the news in other states, there are a lot of bills moving in legislatures around the country with regards to voting, either expanding access or restricting access. A lot of those are being pushed by the 2020 election. There also, there is a fair amount of like electoral movement, legislative movement anyways around elections. I was going to say around election years, but every year is an election year. Pay attention to your municipal elections, people. So Pennsylvania hasn't actually moved much legislation yet. So we have a number of bills introduced, things like voter ID, which has been debated in Pennsylvania before, I believe, passed and then struck down even. Well, that's back. Well, in legislative form. I'm not going to say that is back. Things like attempts to repeal vote by mail entirely. There are a few others to change, like to audit voter rolls and remove names from the voter rolls. I think that's particularly around deceased people, but there's also something that says non-electorate, so I don't entirely know what that term is used to mean. When bills are introduced, they're often a little bit non-specific, and then the language gets built out later. So that's like, some of the more restrictive bills. There's also expansive bills that want to, change voting age or do universal mail-in, more drop boxes, pre-canvassing time, which that's like the big one that the County Commissioners Association really wants. That one, I think, has the most room for bipartisan support. So there's a lot in there, but it's sitting in committee as these election hearings were taking place. The committee was not moving election legislation until after these hearings are done. So we had the finale this week. It was kind of in line with what's been said the whole time. It really wasn't, if you compare the first week and this last week, it sounded pretty similar, honestly. Not to say that there hasn't been valuable testimony throughout the process, but a lot of the big requests for reform have remained the same for months now. So with this finale now, we are waiting on the state government committee to draft a bill or a package of bills. The majority in the state government committee, I should be a little more specific there, that relate to these election hearings. So I reached out to a spokesperson and asked, there are all these bills already introduced, but the news advisory for this final hearing said they're going to come up with a bill. And I was essentially told they haven't done it yet. So it's a little unclear what will happen to the current slate of bills, if they'll get folded into a bill package, if something new will be written. It's a little up in the air, and there was a media availability with the House Majority Leader earlier where he was asked, what's happening in elections, and pretty much gave nothing, essentially gave the very typical from the floor leadership answers of, well, we'll see what committee does. So we don't really know which ones will move where and when. I mean, I imagine the House will start to move fairly swiftly, even as the Senate is still working through its own election things. While they do communicate sometimes, they also, they're somewhat separate and can move on their own. So, I mean, I expect to see some legislation here. That's kind of the overview. Now, I stripped that overview away from all of the intensely political parts of these hearings, and they very much have been. Voting is, if you're paying attention to the news, as a listener probably is, it's incredibly contentious, the voting legislation going on in this country right now. Obviously, I mean, Georgia, hello. That has been a huge deal. And, you know, that's not really that different from Pennsylvania. We have a lot of similar legislation coming through that a lot of other states deal with. States very much legislatures like to share their ideas, it seems, or pull from each other at least. But the difference in Pennsylvania is that when Republicans introduce more restrictive ideas like getting rid of Act 77 or repealing mail-in voting, we have a Democratic governor in Tom Wolf who will veto that. And you know, it's interesting now, the rhetoric around Act 77, because that was a bipartisan bill when it was passed. It's come under a lot of fire.
The Republican.
It was
Republicans.
Oh, there we go. And it's come under a lot of fire. Yeah.
Oh, wait, let me correct myself there. It was a bill sponsored by Senator Lisa Boscola, who's a Democrat, but the amendment that essentially gutted and replaced the bill with all the election-related reforms and mail-in balloting was a Republican amendment. So
very bipartisan. There we go.
Correct.
We got a Democratic introduction, Republican gut and replaced. But yeah, so it's definitely, Democrats have not been pleased through these election hearings. I mean, they've the chair, Democratic chair, Margaret Davidson, she did talk a lot about appreciating the testimony they've heard. You know, we've heard from cybersecurity experts, local county election people, and she said that was all valuable. But Democrats feel like Republicans have used this as a chance to essentially stir up the feeling that the last election was not fair or was not conducted well, and then are using that fear mongering to say that they need all these new restrictive security measures to restore confidence. But Democrats are really saying, well, there was no lost confidence. We did not have fraud or major cheating or anything like that in the last election. So all of these, like, you know, voter ID and getting rid of mail-in ballot, like these ideas are providing a quote unquote security. Whether they actually have security ramifications is something for people who are a little bit more well-researched than me. You're adding like these measures in to something that's not a problem. You know, they're a solution in search of a problem. I'm pretty sure I said that last week. And so that's kind of the Democratic view of this, is that it's just going to be rolling back what was a massive access win last year or in 2019 with Act 77 and mail-in voting that resulted in huge turnouts. I talked to Khadija Kenner, who's at the Pennsylvania Center for, oh shoot, I always get it wrong, Budget and Policy?
Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center.
I will never get it right.
Progressive think tank.
Progressive think tank. She is currently there, but on her way out shortly. And she kind of talked about how, you know, they're looking to protect the level of access we have now, and that people really like the level of access to the ballot. I think she said like 600,000 Pennsylvanians have registered for mail-in ballots for this upcoming May 18th election, which is kind of insane for a municipal election. Now there's an added impetus in this election with our constitutional amendments on it. But yeah, so she's very much a fan of the mail-in ballot system and what it's done. And I'm just gonna like casually plug a little news item here. She is leaving the Budget Center to start the New Pennsylvania Project, which if you pay attention to Georgia, you'll know the New Georgia Project. That's Stacey Abrams, voting rights registration access organization that is widely credited with like some of the huge outcomes that happened in Georgia and huge upticks in voting and that kind of thing. And so May 3rd, the New Pennsylvania Project will be launching. So that will be something very interesting to watch. You know, how voter organizing from the South makes its way up north here. So I'm going to be keeping an eye on that. But like, I mean, it's elections are never far. We have one this year, we have one next year. Elections are every year. And so the election legislation is also always top of mind, but particularly in the wake of what was an incredibly contentious election and something that the General Assembly, Republicans in the General Assembly discussed at length um, before, during, and after.
Yeah, no, I think you sum that up beautifully because there's 10 hearings worth of information there. So many different testifiers, so many different topics from security and technology to the state's own like voter registration data system. So there was a lot there and kind of a lot to sort of take away from that. So I think you did a good job at summarizing all of that there. And I'll just offer a quick comment here, but you touched on how Wolf is kind of like a backstop for um, you know more conservative proposals that probably aren't going to fly as long as he's governor. So I think that divided nature of our state government is probably going to have to result in some level of compromise, like what was included in Act 77, because there were pieces in that bill that Republicans didn't like. There were pieces in that Democrats didn't like. But ultimately, the sort of bipartisan negotiated nature of that bill was what led to that, getting his signature. And if the bill would get jam packed with like voter ID and a repeal of mail-in voting. I would imagine that probably would not last long on Wolf's desk before it gets vetoed. But on the flip side, I don't think Democrats are going to get a further expansion of what they want, whether that's same-day voting or automatic registration or all mail-in voting. I know that's been a proposal that's been floated out. So I think there's some middle ground that's going to have to be found in order for any of these to be, approved, unless the legislature takes a bit of a different tactic and approves them as standalone bills instead of kind of one overarching code bill like Act 77. So that could be interesting to watch in terms of how like legislative strategy impacts what moves and what gets signed. So I think the answer there is to stay tuned because this is a conversation that I'm sure will heat up soon and get even more intense, on the House and Senate floor as these bills actually start to get rolling. Anything else on elections?
Well, a ton actually, but I think
Anything you want to mention on elections?
anything I want to mention, I do think there is an interesting element here. Now there's been, I think the shout out is for WITF, who had a great story last week or earlier this week about the role of the courts in the elections.
Mm.
That I was just a fan of their reporting there. But I do think that was something that came up in my conversation with Kadita Kenner was the way the court stepped in to kind of rule on the laws and the rules, do their job essentially during the last election cycle. That has stayed in the minds of the Republican Party here in Pennsylvania. They are very much not a fan of the way the courts had to step in. Court experts have said that's what courts do is they interpret the law. But I do think that's going to play into the way legislation is written because we had the courts step in on things like naked ballots, on things like drop boxes, and deadlines for returning ballots. Because the court stepped in, I think lawmakers are going to be pretty specific in how they write bills. If they don't want to see the courts interpret certain things again, because the timing was so short before the election that a lot of these rules had to be interpreted. So I imagine we're going to see that come across in some of the legislative language. But like you said, I mean, you said it more optimistically than I was thinking that we might see bipartisanship. I was fully on team gridlock, um, which, not saying that's a good thing, just my.
Well, let me say, I'm not predicting bipartisanship per se, but in order for anything to move, I'm thinking there might have to be bipartisanship.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you said there about will they do standalone versus wrapping bills together is going to be interesting to watch because, last cycle we did see pre-canvassing make it onto the floor, but it was part of a bigger bill with a lot of items in it, like banning drop boxes, I'm pretty sure,
So,
or severely limiting them that Democrats just would not let go through, particularly because of the pandemic and also just a preference for these wider accessible voting options. We did see those like Democratic priority and Republican priorities wrapped together. And that one didn't go so well. But maybe if it's a little bit more of an Act 77 before before people turned on Act 77, we might see some bipartisanship there. I'm very interested to see how the rhetoric picks up because it definitely has not been very friendly either. Lots of yeah. You guys know you're all political capital watchers too. You hear it. It's really a matter of just reading what the actual bill language is and not listening to the statements.
right. And I think it's really going to come down to striking the right balance in terms of, getting a bill through and enacted. So it'll be an adventure, that's for sure. A lot really seemed to change in 2 years from when, Act 77 was passed until now, in terms of both like the law and, the rhetoric surrounding the state's election code. And if I was a betting man, I would say that kind of intense rhetoric and intense feelings about the election will continue. Fortunately, I'm not a betting man though, because if I was and you bet on Harrisburg, you would probably go broke more than you strike it big. So that's all for my gambling lessons or gambling references this episode. I will not be providing lessons. But Sam, anything else you want to touch on before we wrap things up?
I think that is good for this week.
Okay, I think so. There's always more to talk about, but we'll cut it off there for this week. But if you want to catch future episodes or past episodes, you can find us as always at righttoknow.podbean.com or wherever you like to get your podcasts. And you can also find our podcast posted to our site at theplistreporter.com and on our YouTube channel as well. And if you want to check out our written coverage, we do, put a lot of time and effort into the stories that we post. So if you want to check that out, you can subscribe for just $16.67 a month. What am I missing? Newsletters. You can also check out, we offer 2 newsletters now, email newsletters, the Eye Opener, which is our just kind of daily recap of, most recent stories, links to our coverage. And we also offer a Saturday weekend review newsletter called the Reporter Rewind. That kind of spotlights the major issue of the week and also, looks back at some of the other major developments with a link to the podcast and some other great stuff in there. I'll spare the details because if you want to find out more, you can subscribe yourself. And you can do that just by heading to theplistreporter.com and using our Eye Opener form on the right side of our website. And as always, Sam and I are pretty active on Twitter. If you want to find the PList Reporter account, you can find it at the PList Reporter. And you can find myself at Justin_Schweitzer.
And it's Sam_Zern.
Thanks for tuning in this week and enjoy the kind of chilly weather that's going on. It's kind of cold, at least in Harrisburg. So, but it looks nice out. I don't know. So go enjoy it and we will catch you next week. Thanks for listening.